All right. Well, hello, everyone. My name is Tamara Peterson. I use pronouns she, her, hers. And I am very excited to welcome you today to our session, All In, taking a holistic company approach to LGBTQ visibility. I am managing counsel and pride president for Wells Fargo, for our enterprise employee group at Wells Fargo, based in the Twin Cities in Minnesota. And I've been with the company for about 17 years. And I have a great group of panelists with me. And we're so excited to talk with you today about making sure that there's connectivity for the work that you're doing across your company and how to really breed that interconnectivity across that work. We're going to introduce our panelists momentarily. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the work we did last year that was really framing up this idea of a holistic approach, and then talk about how that all came together for us, how we've really brought that forward into the crazy year that is 2020. And then hopefully also be providing you with some tips to take back to your companies, to take back to the ongoing work that all of you are doing for workplace equality. Just a housekeeping note, we are going to be paying attention in the chat window, in the Zoom chat window specifically, to comments and questions. We can weave in some questions potentially as we're going along with our discussion, but we'll also have an intentional time for questions a little bit later in the presentation. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get us started introducing our panelists. And Katie, if you can advance our slide to our panelist display. And Monique, if I can invite you to please introduce yourself to our attendees.
Sure, my name is Monique Evans. I am based here in Dallas, Texas. I work in the equipment finance department, and I've been with Wells Fargo. I just celebrated my 6th-year anniversary back in September, and I'm excited to be here. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Monique. How about Katie?
Hello all, I am Katie Harrison. I am based in Charlotte, North Carolina. I am in human resources and I do organization development and executive coaching with our leaders. And I have just finished 4 years serving as the HR liaison for our Pride Employee Resource Group. And I've been with Wells Fargo for almost 25 years now. Welcome.
Great, thanks, Katie. How about John Lake?
Hi, everyone, Out and Equal family. Miss you all in person. I'm John Lake. I am with Wells Fargo's enterprise marketing team, where I help lead diverse segment marketing and am specifically involved with the LGBTQ segment. This is my 7th year, I think, at Wells Fargo, and my 11th Out and Equal conference. And my pronouns are he and him.
Impressive track record. Thanks, John. And finally, to round us out, we have Ryan Rosa.
Thanks, Tamara. My name is Ryan Rosa. I'm a business support consultant for the Consumer Lending Group at Wells Fargo. I am the Pride ERGs Enterprise Workforce Outcomes Co-Chair. I use they, them, theirs pronouns. I identify as bi+, and also as gender fluid.
Great. Thanks so much, Ryan. So to help set the stage, we thought we would talk a little bit specifically about some activities that happened within Wells Fargo in 2019, last summer. The ERG, the Pride ERG had, for quite some time, we had been focused on support of our transgender community. And in sort of the 2018-2019 timeframe, we decided we really needed to be much more intentional about how we were focusing on and supporting our gender diverse community. So specifically looking to include gender fluid, gender non-conforming, gender queer, non-binary, two-spirit, and both in support of, how does that show up for our team members, but also how does that show up for our customers. So I'm gonna hit the high points of some of what we had happening in that summer timeframe of 2019 when a lot of our activity came together. And then we're going to take a step back and talk about how that happened and the impacts it had, because we were able to leverage these various activities that all happened in a connected way in a fairly short time frame within the organization. So when we look at the 2019 areas of focus, one thing that's important to note is some of it was really good intentional work, and some of it was perhaps a little bit more serendipitous. This first event that's on the list was a company-wide inclusion fireside chat that actually was being put forward by our Enterprise Diversity and Inclusion Office. It was a live broadcast across our company on the topic of belonging. We had Aaron Euretis, the CEO of Out and Equal, come and join us in person for this discussion, which we then shot out through a live broadcast, and we had a video replay available to really all of our employees across the company. But what we did, keeping in mind this focus that we had on the broader transgender and gender diverse community, was wanted to be really intentional in how we set up the conversation with Aaron to include some specific points of discussion about non-binary individuals and those who identify as gender diverse. So that happened in June of 2019. At that time, we also were working on finalizing development of guidance for managers within the company so managers of gender diverse employees that helped them by addressing terminology, what kind of assistance was available, looking at HR resources overall to help make sure that our gender diverse employees were being supported, and their managers were also had a place to come with questions that they might have. We had some external marketing that was happening, looking at Pride Month, right? And all the activity that we know our organizations do around that period of time. We had external marketing that had some focus on non-binary and transgender business owners, which was really exciting for us to see. And towards the end of Pride Month last year, we were approached to participate in signing the Title VII business amicus brief that we've heard about, that a number of large organizations signed, supporting the position that anti-discrimination protections on the basis of sex really should be applicable to also sexual orientation and gender identity. So we made the decision to participate in that. That was released in early July, I believe the amicus brief was filed in 2019. In late July 2019, we actually rolled out an update to our employee policies for US employees, for US-based employees, that permitted inclusion of their pronouns in their email signature and business cards. And although it took a little bit longer, we were really happy that our international employees were able to have pronouns available to them this year. So that happened. It just took us a little bit more time to get that put through and implemented. And then we had some great internal company-wide stories that focused on that inclusion fireside chat that we had with Aaron on belonging, that talked about the pronoun policy, that really helped to support the overall experience for our employees, and this idea of inclusivity, to really make sure we were educating them about what we were doing, why it mattered. And that was happening, after the broadcast for the inclusion fireside chat. As we rolled out the pronoun policy, we had these internal stories that really talked about the importance of that development. And finally, as we moved into September, the Pride Employee Resource Group hosted a panel discussion on allyship across the spectrum. So, right, all the letters, and how we support each other more intentionally. And then, of course, the broad allyship that we find for those external to the LGBTQ segment as well. So that's just a little bit of a picture into how this came together for us in one moment in time. Again, some of it very intentional items that we'd been working on for years. Some of it, frankly, a little bit of a stroke of luck, which we were happy to take. But now with that kind of framework and foundation behind us, I want to go ahead and turn us to how it is that we built the relationships, we built the connectivity to have this kind of experience happen for our community last year. And so Katie, I'm going to go ahead and start with you and maybe ask you to talk about the underlying development of the relationship within HR specifically. And, you know, I know that that showed up in a variety of ways with handbook policy updates and manager guidance, but maybe you can just take us a step back and talk us through how we got there.
Great. Well, thank you. Yeah, so I joined the Pride Enterprise Leadership Team in 2017. All of our enterprise ERGs have an HR consultant assigned to them. And my predecessor was an ER consultant by his day job. And so, you know, when he passed the baton to me and I talked about the role, a lot of his work, he had helped consult on our Transitioning in the Workplace Guide, version 1, with ER, and he had handled and addressed some employee concerns himself. So when I started the role, that was really kind of how my HR predecessor talked about the role to me. And I was like, okay, let's be clear, I'm not an ER consultant. I'm not going to play one here. That's not my job. And I'd put this in the serendipitous bucket because some of the work did start with individual employee questions and concerns. And I had admitted I am not an ER consultant. I'm not a policy expert. I'm not a benefits expert. So I just started reaching out to my colleagues. Like I said, I have been here nearly 25 years. I do not know everybody in HR, but I know a lot of people. And I just, whether I knew them or not, just started trying to find the right HR person to connect them to. And along the way, started to learn that part of my role was education. So really at a one-on-one basis with some HR folks, found where I had an in, like this employee came with this concern, can I talk to you about it? Talk to me about what the policy is. A lot of times team employees were calling because they didn't want to make the first call into HR. They didn't feel safe. And I got to do that for them. And that was part of my role. But what that turned into was educating HR peers and partners and educating myself about where our policies and benefits stood at the time, and began to see trends and common themes where we had opportunities for advancement. So I think it was a good thing that I wasn't an ER expert because I got to make a lot of new relationships. Some folks I'd worked with in the past and some I hadn't, but I just started picking up the phone and calling people and helping, doing some warm transfers for some of our employees, and helping educate and spotlight where we had some challenges in our benefits and policies. Then that turned into being, oh, thank you. What is ER? Look at my HR, employee relations. So if an employee has a complaint or concern, that's a place where an employee can call to get consulting on how to handle possibly treatment in the workplace, policy questions, and managers can call there too. Thank you so much. Great catch. And then we started to get invited to some, I think the first big one I participated in, corporate real estate reached out to us, and they were working on updating their policies around updating and building restrooms. And they invited Pride in, and myself, and at that time we had a transgender engagement chair, participated in those conversations to help represent the needs of the LGBT community. First lens at that time was very trans oriented, but it really built the base to begin to expand understanding of needs of our gender fluid, non-binary community, as well as the trans community. And through that, and then I started to see the repeating characters in this play, right? So there's several HR policy people that kept showing up in these conversations, and I kept calling them either in the group or one-on-one to discuss some of the themes across what employees were calling me about or reaching out to somebody on the leadership team about. So those are some of the key, I think, foundational elements, Tamara, that built a lot of the relationships and connectivity into different areas in HR in like probably the first 2 years of my tenure with the group.
Thanks, Katie. Really organic how that starts to come together, but certainly had some intentionality on your part as well as you sought the right resources. And I know, so I go back to a moment having a coffee chat actually with Ryan several years ago, where we talked about the need for us to develop some kind of a resource, some kind of a guide for managers, like we had for managers of transitioning team members, that was more specific to the experience of our gender diverse team members and those who identify as non-binary, where there wouldn't be a specific transition happening, right? And that conversation was the little seed that was planted and bloomed into this this very helpful guide that was created. And Ryan, I wonder if you might talk a little bit about your role with Pride, with the advisory committee, and how that group participated in the creation of the guide, making sure that we were sort of covering the right topics, having the right terminology included, and what your experience was with building those relationships to make sure that we were, getting this right for our employees.
Yeah, absolutely. So as I mentioned in my brief introduction, I am the Enterprise Workforce Outcomes Chair for our Pride ERG, and I also serve on Gender Identity and Expression Advisory Group that kind of advises the enterprise leadership team on gender diverse folks in terms of gender identity and expression. And as Tamara mentioned, we kind of realized we only have some supporting resources for transgender individuals. And while that's great, first of all, those need a little bit of work to clean them up and kind of bring them current as they add some outdated terminology. We didn't really have anything for non-binary employees. And frankly, as I was coming out, I didn't really see anything, any institutionalized resources for managers or for me just as an employee on what my being non-binary meant in the workplace. And through that advisory group, we partnered with employee relations, and we partnered with our employee assistance counseling folks to really put together kind of a similar set of guidelines for managers and employees on how how to ensure non-binary team members were supported and included in the same way that we had put those resources together for transgender team members. One of the things that we still struggle with and that we still keep going back and kind of revising year over year is the language. Because as we all know in the queer community, especially as it relates to gender identity and expression, terminology is growing and changing and evolving every single day. And we on a corporate side don't always see that evolution until it's kind of a little past us. And so it was really important that as we were meeting with those partners and we were working together on the documents, that we were being really forward thinking in how we approached language in them, making sure that we call out a lot of different, unique identities, especially in the gender or the non-binary space, like gender fluid, gender queer, gender ambiguous, gender non-conforming, and many more, to make it clear when folks were going to those resources that it was for them. Because we know that not everyone that identifies in the trans community or in the non-binary community identify as non-binary or as non-binary directly. They may use another label. And so, at a company of over 260,000 employees, we know that everyone's in a really different place on their diversity inclusion journey, if you will. And a manager who may have very little exposure to the LGBTQ community, let alone non-binary individuals, may not have any clue where to start and how to support a non-binary team member. And if our documentation, if our support guides were not there to provide some of that information and provide some of that level setting, you know, managers might end up putting some really strange or hurtful questions back to their team members. They may make incorrect assumptions that can also be hurtful. You know, even in the best of intentions, if we weren't really trying to be forward thinking in how we develop these documents, it could cause, honestly, just as much damage as help for team members who, especially for team or employees who are in, you know, maybe some areas of the country where LGBTQ inclusion is a little less far along, or maybe doesn't exist at all. We wanted to make sure that everyone knew exactly what groups of people we were talking about and exactly how to support those individuals. And so that's kind of what I'd say about how we develop those and kind of the key parts of the advisory group and, you know, the partnerships with our HR, ER, and employee assistance counseling folks really came together to develop that content.
Great, thank you, Ryan. You know, the advisory groups, I saw some comments in the chat about, you know, really appreciating that idea. It's been hugely helpful for us to build greater connectivity, even with the enterprise leadership team for our network, having put in place a specific transgender engagement chair. You know, we recognize that as the voice of one person, right? And there's benefit to having the experiences of others brought into the room as well. And so having this advisory group has been really, really beneficial to get other voices in the room, other perspectives. We've had some similar work that we'll talk about a little bit later with another group that has done some advising to the enterprise team. But Monique, I want to shift to you and have you talk a little bit about your experience in that advisory group as well. And you know, just if you also want to talk a bit about your participation later in the 2019 list of activities. You were a participant in that panel discussion on allyship across the spectrum. So happy to have you, you know, share some thoughts about connectivity there.
Thank you. Before I even go into that, one of the things that really stands out to me, and that I've been holding on to since morning when we had the plenary, there was something that was mentioned by Glennon. There's a particular quote that I wrote down, and it said, "Belonging is not dependent on fitting in." The thing about the advisory committee that we have with Wells Fargo, it was established as a secondary need. Was a primary need, but for a secondary issue, right? So what happened was I self-nominated along with Ryan and maybe some other people. Wells Fargo has it where you can self-identify. And I think that that's wonderful because it kind of just like gives a green light for people to be able to approach you if they have questions, if they want to even seek out somebody to go along with their journey, because there's still a lot of folks who have yet to come out. So with that being said, Wells Fargo established the Transgender Engagement Chair, and there were so many wonderful interviews, I was told, that they decided to create a committee, and that committee supports the Transgender Engagement Chair. What I love about that committee, and I'm an advisor on the committee along with Ryan, it allows me to think beyond myself. It allows me to see beyond the transgender experience. With the help of Ryan and other folks, I understand the non-binary journey a little bit better, especially when we, you know, cultivate and update the guides that we have, and we strategize on, you know, the policies inclusive of folks like Katie with the HR department and everything like that. it allows us to see things differently, or it allows me to see things differently. I think that, you know, if any company out there can establish something like that, it's great. You know, it's one thing to say that diversity and inclusion exists on paper, but when you're able to look around and see folks who embody that, it makes a big difference. So right now, we are in the process of welcoming our secondary lead by the name of William Crook, who identifies as non-binary. The previous transgender engagement chair was Sasha, love her. So William is taking her place, and I look forward to us just doing wonderful works ahead. And I know that William is going to offer so many, you know, wonderful insights to the perspective of a non-binary person with regards to this challenge that we face, and also allow all of us to realize that everybody can be an ally. You can be an ally for anybody, especially anybody who's marginalized. And so I remember I received an email around the time that they were trying to decide who to narrow down the search for the new engagement chair. And somebody reached out to me and they said, have they decided on who, you know, who they were going to choose or whatever? And I said, yeah, William Crook. Their pronouns are they and them, and they're non-binary. And that's the thing. I think that as an ally, I think that that was the least that I could do. But, you know, I wanted them, if they were going to reach out to William, to understand this is the mode and the method of a respectful approach. And so we had the ally panel speaking about allyship back in September of 2019. And the work still continues, and the understanding still continues. And we'll touch base on that in a few minutes, but I think it's a wonderful thing. And if everybody realizes that, you know, regardless of whether you're trans or non-binary or whatever marginalized group that you fall under, you can be an ally for somebody else. Because, you know, at the end of the day, we're all seeking to obtain equality, and we're seeking to obtain equity, and we just want to be recognized as human beings.
Yeah, I love that, Monique. I had that quote and a later one from this morning. Unity.
Yeah, it was awesome.
Yeah, and then there was the comments about unity versus uniformity that came up a bit later in the plenary also. I just really love that connectivity. And, you know, John, when we think about how does this all connect, we've been talking a lot about, you know, the experiences of those of us who help lead the work for the employee group. And obviously, you know, you're in marketing. You're not an official member of our group, although we certainly would claim you. But really, really have this great connectivity into marketing. And I think, you know, it'd be great to hear from you sort of how we ended up as a company evolving to a place where we were able to be fully inclusive of gender diverse, you know, and transgender individuals, and maybe share a bit about that story.
Absolutely. And just, I was blown away by that discussion this morning by Glennon, and I'm done chasing dirty pink bunnies. So hope all of you will join me in making that pledge. So from a marketing perspective, our journey, it's been a long-term evolution that happened in kind of a parallel path to how full inclusiveness was happening internally at Wells Fargo. But, you know, I think the two of them really working hand in hand was key. We couldn't have done what we did in the marketplace if we had not first really created a strong foundation in the workplace. So Katie, if you want to advance to the next slide, if possible. There we go. So just a few examples of, you know, this is a little illustration of our journey from a marketing perspective. You can see on the left there some of our earliest LGBTQ advertising. I mean, it's perfectly harmless, didn't exactly break any barriers or out of any boxes. But at the time, our primary organizational focus was really showing support to the community through participation in Pride events. We'd been doing that for a while. So that really was kind of where we were at the time. Then you move to the middle ad, and I think that this reflects the position that we had evolved to and kind of taken around the time of marriage equality, and it really kind of focuses on that moment, signing on to the Obergefell amicus brief, recognizing this truly astounding and amazing moment that the LGBTQ was facing at that time. And then post-marriage equality, the internal conversation really turned, at least from a marketing perspective, on how we can better represent diversity beyond just showing a gay couple in an ad. So I find this ad on the right really interesting from an evolutionary standpoint, because for years we saw companies being called out because their LGBTQ ads were too vague and they didn't show a true connection between two men or two women, so the ad was gay enough. But the point of this one, and this is very intentional, was to be somewhat vague, because the idea of what it meant to be LGBTQ was evolving, both outside and inside the company. And we wanted to expand that as well in what we were putting out there into market. So what I love about this is these individuals could be trans, they could be gender non-binary, but it really helped expand kind of what we were trying to do from a marketing perspective, because we were on this journey internally. If you go to the next slide, we'll see how that evolved even further. This is creative from 2019 on the left there. And this was coming out of a couple of years when we were really prioritizing progress for our trans team members internally. And from a marketing standpoint, it was reflected in this campaign, the Empowerful campaign, where we were really intentional. I mean, we had the opportunity to feature a gay couple or a lesbian couple, but we really wanted to feature an empowered trans business owner. So that's the individual who took center stage in this campaign. And I think this came out of what was happening internally, because it really helped to shape how we wanted to express our external support for this community. It was a conversation we were having inside the company, so it became a part of the conversation that we wanted to have outside of the company. And then finally in 2020, as our internal conversation picked up about gender fluidity, driven by years of conversations in the community that were finally reflected in changes we were making inside the company, our external marketing shifted as well. And in this case, you see on the right a video that featured Nick Casey, who's a designer of gender neutral fashion. They use they, them pronouns. And being able to amplify Nick's story was so meaningful to me, and I think to a lot of us, not just because they were so inspiring, but also because of the way they put a face and a human story on what it means to be gender non-binary, which dovetailed so well with what we were doing inside the company, our pronoun policy and other momentum we were making around education about these issues. So I feel it went beyond marketing and really became a part of this holistic effort that we were pursuing throughout the company. So that's just a little walk through our journey marketing and how we got to the place where, at the center of the campaign was a gender non-binary individual.
Great. Thanks so much, John. I think, one of the things that speaks to me always in the marketing pieces is this storytelling aspect and how important it was that it aligned, but also, I think storytelling, we know internally has been incredibly impactful to help move understanding within the company. And Ryan, I'd like to come back to you because there were a couple of moments in 2019 where you willingly shared your story. You became I think very vulnerable across our entire company by putting your story out there and sharing it so willingly, both, in the Inclusion Fireside Chat during that live broadcast across the company, and then also for an internal written piece. And I wonder if you might just talk to us a little bit about, the focus in those two instances with sharing your story, and your experience and why you decided that connectivity was important to bring forward as part of this work.
Yeah, absolutely, Tamara. Thank you. I think for me, the biggest piece was I'm white. I come from an upper middle class background. I'm well educated. I have a lot of privilege. And despite the challenges that I have certainly faced, it's extremely important for me as a non-binary person, as a bisexual person, to stand up and share my story, because not everyone has the platform, not everyone has the access, and not everyone has the ability to do that because of where they come from and their experiences. And so to me, it was critical to stand up in support of my communities, and those that identify in communities that may be adjacent to how I identify. In those two instances, in sharing my story in particular, and kind of doing some of the education and just generally speaking up, it was pretty well received, and that kind of builds momentum, right? It's about education, and it builds momentum for future events, for continuing to do that work, both for me personally and for all of us. There were, of course, the odd, not very pleasant or downright rude comments, and it wasn't always well received. But here's the thing: it's necessary work, and that's going to happen no matter where we are. But the work's not going to advance if we're not willing to stand up and share our stories, especially for those of us who have the access and ability to do so, because as I said, not everyone does. And so it's just, to me, it was really critical to use my privilege in a way that would benefit others, and use some of the access that I had to elevate others in the community who may be less privileged or more marginalized than I might be. It's not an easy journey. There is an exhausting amount of vulnerability. I'm an introvert, which is hilarious because this is my second session in 2 days, but I'm an introvert. Telling my story to an audience via, live sessions or company communications to over 260,000 employees potentially is exhausting just to think about, even now. And it's happened. It's like a year in the past. But it's just, I think it's work that absolutely has to happen. And besides it having to happen, I want to make space for people like me and others to be, to access the same success that I've had, to be elevated. And frankly, it needs to come from that authentic place of someone who's in the community sharing their story at some point. Because that's how folks who are further behind on their D&I journey or not even on the journey yet, that's how they learn. That's how they understand. That's how we humanize ourselves. And that's a lot of pressure to some extent on our communities. But it is really important for us who can stand up and share our stories to do so. So that's kind of, the success, some of the hard stuff that came along with it, but it's work that has to be done.
Absolutely. And, lots of kudos I see in the chat, Ryan, to you for sharing your story and doing the work on behalf of the community. Certainly we feel that gratitude. And, I know as we talk about those internal opportunities to show up, it's a really great moment for visibility. And also I think it's a great moment for allyship, right? For people to talk about why it matters when I, as a cis woman, put my pronouns on my email signature, because it makes the path easier for everyone. When that's just part of what's there. So really, I think compelling comments about the storytelling and the work behind that. So thank you for that. John, I'm glad you've rejoined us. I see there's been some Zoom hiccups, but
sorry, unstable connection.
You're good. I want to come back to you and talk a little bit about the moments where we were able to leverage this kind of interactivity that was happening within the synergies that were happening within the work to help press some things forward. We had been having conversations within the company about pronouns for quite some time. And there was a lot of commentary about, sort of when is the right time as an organization, when are you ready? And I think, frankly, as we moved into the summer of 2019, we were able to point to these conversations that were happening that were going to be company-wide. We were able to point to the manager guide that was in development as additional support for our managers that would be available if we went ahead and moved forward with the pronouns. And then we knew we were going to have this opportunity coming up in September, when the employee group was going to have conversations that we'd be able to reinforce. And so there was a fair amount of sort of leveraging that activity that was happening to really press us forward from a policy perspective. The other thing that comes up for me is, we had internal conversations about participating in the amicus brief. And, when we look at the internal story, that piece is there, but the external story was happening as well. And particularly given the focus for the Title VII cases on sexual orientation and gender identity, I'd just love to hear your comments about how that helped with respect to, sort of the conversations that needed to be had about how we showed up as a company and the authenticity that we were able to bring.
Yeah, and I apologize if I go out again, but hopefully we can get through this. So yeah, I mean, this question brings up a lot in me, because in former roles before I came to Wells Fargo, I used to advise companies. And I used to say that there were 3 steps to full LGBTQ inclusion. First, you get the right internal policies in place. And years ago, that meant the right benefits and protections primarily. And then after that, a company has the right, and also I feel the responsibility, to reach out to LGBT consumers through marketing and external facing messages. So once you get your internal house in order, you can go external with it. And then third, a company can take on advocacy. So things like you mentioned, signing on to amicus briefs and business coalitions that really help make broader change for the community. And I kind of used to think that these were the 3 linear steps, and you check off those boxes, and once you get to that advocacy space, you've really reached the pinnacle and done your job. But I think what we found working together these last few years is that these 3 kind of platforms are all continually evolving. And it's critical for those who help drive the decisions that impact these 3 areas to continuously be in close contact to monitor together how change is happening, both internally and externally. HR, Katie, you have your eye on the workplace. Marketing, we have our eye on the marketplace. And we work with our government relations teams, communications, who all have kind of this eye on how a company can really get out into the community and help advocate. So together, I think they create a complete picture of what a company's commitment can be. And it's not really a linear journey, the way things evolve. So when a subject such as gender fluidity, like we're talking about today, really started to become a focus and a truth in the community that was someplace that we needed to go as a company, you almost have to start all over again in the workplace, in the marketplace, and how you become an advocate. It's not just getting through this process and you're at the end. Sometimes you have to go back to the beginning again. And I'll say that the role an ERG can play, and Tamara, what your team has done such a great job is bringing those stakeholders together, especially because, again, going back to what we've talked about earlier, that's how you put a colleague's face and story to what otherwise is just an abstract concept for many of the decision makers out there. So I hope that helps kind of illustrate the beauty of working together and continuing to be, I don't know, in tune with what's going on, because it's not just this linear path that you're going down.
I think that's right. And I really appreciate that perspective. And, you know, speaking of nonlinear, right? So this all happened mid 2019, summer into fall. And we had started to develop some plans for what comes next for us. And then of course, 2020 hit, and we all know the year that has ensued and all of the curveballs we've been thrown. But I think it's important to talk about from these relationships, not only how they develop, but how we can utilize them and really leverage them going forward, both for expected continued growth, right? As well as for unexpected developments. So Katie, maybe you can talk to us about, you know, what was going to come next from the manager guide, from the work we were doing with HR. I know there've been some additional efforts coming off of the successful implementation of both, you know, that manager guide and when we were able to launch the pronoun policy, but would love to hear sort of, you know, those next iterations of where we go. Katie, you've got to come off mute.
I got it. I'm on mute. I'm off mute now. So thank you. Yeah. So a couple of things come to mind. So similar to Ryan and Monique, I participated in the development of the gender expression and identity guide resource for managers and team members. And what it looked like previously was, you know, Monique and Ryan have both today shared very, very compelling stories that as we've become friends, you know, helped me understand their journey and their experience in the organization, that I was able to take forth to HR partners. That work started with my role was like opening a door. Like at first when I started, I was helping advocate by telling people stories to help educate HR. That time I was able to really open the door and bring people to tell their own stories. And what that's turned into is my role has lessened. I'm less of a character, and even I've since jumped off, finished my term, and somebody else is there, but hopefully her role will be less because we've gotten team members to the table telling their own stories and helping educate HR professionals about, you know, what is really needed by our community, and not me having to tell other people's stories for them. So that's great. But one of the interesting things that happened is they get calls from team members and employees. And so sometimes they are now calling us for some consultation. Like, I didn't mean for that to happen, but they had enough kind of like, oh, this is kind of happening. I'd like to get somebody's opinion about that. And they would reach out to the group at times, or reach out to us one-on-one, depending on what the question is, for some feedback and guidance as these HR professionals are trying to support other employees calling in with questions and concerns that hadn't been covered in the guide. So they're like self-learning and teaching and educating their colleagues as well. It also has accelerated some of the other policy movement. Dress code has been a challenge in the past. Some of the employee issues that I gotten were around gender-based dress codes. I'm in a professional setting. Why do I have to wear a tie? I'm gender fluid. I'm non-binary. And why do I have to wear a tie where some people can wear sweaters? And same HR policy person was connected to all of that. We've been tinkering with that for years. And in 2020, my HR policy person we got all the materials together, presented it. It was on the books for an amendment to our personal appearance policy to say we respect gender expression, and we do not have gender-based dress codes permitted in the organization. And with 2020, with the COVID stuff coming in, the employee handbook was basically cutting all policy updates that weren't regulatory. And without me even knowing it, the HR policy person said, yes, but can we do this one, please? You know, I don't think she said please, but she was able to get that be the only non-regulatory amendment to our employee handbook. And so that's the expansion of allyship that I've learned about in the last 4 years working with Pride, is to help make other ambassadors. And because no one of us can do it all. And so it's been really exciting to see the expansion of work that's been seeded over the last 4 years that will carry forward and in an exponential rate. And that to me is the real potential of this work and momentum. When we did the pronouns, lots of resistance and concern, are we ready? And that's not the noise that we got about the personal appearance policy. So I think that's some of the momentum we're building for future changes.
Yeah, I love that. And really, love that as we looked at all of the things being cut, that HR of their own volition said, we need to keep this, it's important. I think that really speaks to the significance of that relationship and the learning that was happening over the course of the last few years. I'm really interested, Ryan and Monique, on your perspectives with respect to the advisory committees and their work. And Ryan, I saw a question come up in the chat specifically about self-ID options, and we've been working on looking at some new iterations of self-ID options for identification, and we've had some engagement on that. But I also wonder if, it might be good to talk about some of the work of the BI+ group with respect to helping to, do similar types of education for the employees. But I'll just open it to the two of you to maybe share a little bit more about, where do the advisory committees go from, 2019 kind of forward to today and into the future?
Yeah, Monique, would you want to jump in first?
Sure. I have a lot of things in my mind. Katie said a lot of things. And then even as you led up to our question, Tamara, you said a lot of things. And as it pertains to the pronoun guideline, I think it's fabulous, but I think, that's the least little thing that we can do. I think, and I'll expound on that in a second, but I think that, we have the ability as adults to shape, and we have the responsibility actually as adults to shape and demand how people treat us. And we have it in our full capacity to shape and demand, how our walk in the world is going to be. Now, there's a lot of things that are not in our control. And I think back to, when I first started, in my career, like 20 years ago, who knows the conversations that were had about me outside of my earshot. But I think back to Out and Equal 2019, there was a guy, I want to believe that he worked at Indeed. One of the questions that he asked, and it still sticks with me to this day, he said, how can we attract more transgender and non-binary applicants? And the reality is, when you're a corporation that's doing the right thing, and you guys mentioned the amicus brief and, you know, corporations that are making it be public that this is their stance, that they're for, you know, diversity, inclusion, and equity. And that's on the outside. But on the inside, when you have representation like me, like Ryan, like so many other folks who are saying, hey, we work here and we love it, you know, because of not only it's great to earn a paycheck, but when you can come to work and who you are is not a reason for somebody to fire you, and you can be expressive from day to day if you'd like to, whether it's a suit or whether it's a dress, as long as it's, you know, professional and presentable, who cares? I think that the whole pronoun thing is just, it's wonderful, but you know, there's so much more, and I look forward to the future. Again, I said that we have a new transgender engagement chair, and I'm sure that they have so many wonderful ideas. But the wonderful thing about where we are now is that the footing and the foundation is so solid. I'm wearing our 2019 shirt. So I think that, you know, the future is bright. You know, I think that a lot of people are in various places in 2020. And one of the things that I told Aaron is that I'm glad that they still had this conference, this summit this year, because at first I thought it was going to be canceled. There's great work to be done. There's so much that's already been done, and, you know, kudos for that, but there's still so much to do. And having worked in banking and finance and being in a position where I had to use a different bathroom because somebody had a problem with, you know, my gender identity, rather than asking me or getting to know me or befriending me, they relied on their fears. Whatever those fears were stemmed from, I don't know, because I was just there to do my job and earn a paycheck. So one thing that stands out for me that was mentioned within Wells Fargo is that Pride is still about community. And we have to make sure that there's interconnectivity. And that runs the gamut across all letters, to make sure that there's not bias and prejudice amongst us. Bi folks need to get to know trans folks. Trans folks, you know, be open to gay folks getting to know them, and lesbians as such. I get it. There's sometimes it's hard to do, to be vulnerable and authentic, but it's the best thing to do. And it's been wonderful for me, not to say that it's been easy, but to know that I can show up every day as myself, who I said that I am, and I'm still respected, and it hasn't hindered me in the way that, you know, my family or even myself at one point in time thought that it was going to, but I was still willing to just do it. And so now to be in this leadership role and see things from a different perspective, and to know, you know, what goes into creating policies and strategizing the guidelines and things of that nature. It's amazing, but we still have to make sure that folks feel as if they're empowered, because we can do all of this, but if folks aren't involved on the ground level and letting us know what their needs are, I think that it would kind of limit us. So, you know, I'm so thankful again that we have the advisory committee, and folks do reach out to us to say, hey, this is our issue and this is what's going on. Do you have any insight to that? But there's still so much more work to do. Go ahead, Ryan.
Thanks, Monique. That's really insightful. I think in terms of self-identification, you know, I've seen a few questions come in, as Tamara mentioned. Self-identification is a really big part of making truly inclusive organizations. And I'll be honest, I think we have a fair amount of work to do in that space. We collect a lot of information in terms of how people identify, some of it in HR systems, some of it just, all of it voluntary, of course, some of it just for the ERG, for Pride. to know who our members are, kind of get that cross section of who we represent and help inform what the needs are. But I think we need to do more there. And we are working on kind of reconfiguring what that looks like for Wells Fargo and our employees. But I think one of the ways that, to me, that I've heard in a few other sessions during Summit so far is how do we mobilize that information, right? There's a lot of protections around that type of information and how it can be collected and how it can be used. But I think we do a pretty good job of giving folks a lot of different options to identify with. In the future, we're going to do even better in that space and kind of make it very clear that we understand since the last time these questions were updated that we have a much broader understanding of LGBTQ plus identities, but how we mobilize with that information in the future, I think is going to be really critical to how we continue to do the work. Because we need to understand our membership, we need to understand where the needs are, and I think better utilizing some of that information would also help us on a customer front because, let's be honest, at a 265 or 270,000 person organization, we have employees that are pretty much a cross section of society in the US and globally. And so if we have a better understanding of who our employees are and who our Pride ERG members are, then I don't think it's a very broad leap or a very big leap to say we would better understand our customers and what their needs are. So that's kind of where I'll leave it for self-ID, Tamara.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Ryan. And, we really have tried to do a couple of things with self-ID. One is expand the identification options. Today, we are still using a system that has been around for a bit. And the question for gender identity is, there's the EEO, male, female, and then are you transgender? Do you identify as transgender? And that's kind of it. And so we're working to enhance that. And we have a new system being deployed soon that will include more identification options. And we recognize the importance of that. And then I saw some questions in the chat about the use of the data, which Ryan, I think you were speaking to as well, that, there's so much more to be done in that space. And I think options for how companies can evolve and find ways to use the information more effectively. We could probably talk a whole session on that. So I'm going to put that to the side and ask if you have specific questions about self-ID or want to noodle that at all. I'm happy, reach out to me. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm happy to have those conversations. And then just quickly, and John, I'm going to prep you because I'm going to come to you in a minute about COVID. but I did see some questions about pronouns, and it took us a while, several years, to get the approval to put pronouns in emails and on business cards. We had been generating that as an idea for some time before we were able to build some momentum behind it. And for any of you that are, I think, working that struggle right now, one thing that I would say was a huge learning for us, and it was not on our radar really at all, was what a tremendous benefit it was to our global workforce and to so many of our employees who have gender neutral names, like Quincy. There are people who, identify with different genders who have those names, and those pronouns have been hugely helpful. So if you're fighting that fight today, I mean, one thing to think about is expanding how you talk about the impact, because it certainly is beyond this community, and that might be impactful for some companies. Okay, so John, with that, I want to talk about these relationships and kind of the synergies and how we used some of what we've learned over the course of, the last few years building these relationships when all of a sudden COVID hit and everything changed and everything was different. And we were suddenly having to partner in a whole new way. Can you just talk with us a little bit about, how that showed up for you, how these engagements and partnerships showed up?
Sure. So one of the many challenges I think that COVID brought to us was to ensure we didn't lose momentum. all of this work that we had been doing. And I think, as you mentioned before, it's so that we could maintain community and support. I think Monique actually mentioned it. This idea of community and pride is a time when that shows up more than any other time, right? And so we were facing down pride, where usually we can participate in 60 or so celebrations around the country and come together as a company and come together as communities, without the ability to do that for the first time in decades. So since June provides us with that window for visibility, it was so critical to make sure we still had it. And I think that with the connectivity that we'd created between the ERG, with our communications team, with HR and marketing, we were able to leverage channels that were available to us in ways that we'd never really thought of before. How do you create a virtual Pride Festival? Well, there are virtual ways that we can do that internally. How do you create a virtual Pride Parade? Well, have everyone send in a video of a float that they've created at home. So, we had a bunch of creative ideas, both, frivolous, like the parade, but also very meaningful, which I think some of the content that we were able to create around the virtual Pride booths really helped provide some exposure for some parts of our community that don't usually get it. So I thought it was a very thoughtful way that we approached it, a very holistic way, of course. Some things turned out better than others and had more success than others, but we learned a lot, and hopefully our team members still felt some sense of community and support, even though we were all apart. But it was really going back to all of those relationships that we had built over the years and maintaining the momentum that we had created through COVID.
Yeah, one of the things that's
better than you can probably list some of the things that we did that the employee resource group was really responsible for.
Well, what struck me is we had these connections that we'd started building, and we pulled communications in much more intentionally as we moved into this virtual environment, and really leveraged not only sort of the marketing aspects of Pride, but also our external communications. How was that going to look for the stories we told? And as we had all these activities happening, as we shifted virtual for the employee network, we leveraged some of the really cool stuff, like this shoebox parade idea that actually was narrated as a 15-minute long, parade of shoebox float pictures. And we were able to pull some of that in with videos, comments from some of our leaders around the company, some of our senior leaders in the company, as well as the ERG leaders, and talking about what that had looked like. And so it felt much more cohesive than maybe in years past, where we had heard about what was happening externally, but we weren't as involved in it. This felt much more intentional. And I think, so a couple of things, just for a time check, we're getting closer to the end of the session. I want to make sure if people have questions, let's make sure we're getting those into chat. And we want to go through our panelists and come back to this topic of partnership and ideas for finding the right partners. So we'll start there. I'm going to kind of monitor chat for questions, and we'll get to those as we'll pepper those through this conversation. But maybe Katie, we can come to you for tips on finding the right partners and building the approach as we look at the topic and how people can bring this information forward into their own work.
Yeah. So for me, mine was all about using my network and keep making the calls till I found the right person, an open person. I would say it's a journey of planting seeds along the way, and I had a very shared my learning journey with my HR colleagues to help bring them into their own learning. So I was really kind of bringing them in instead of telling people everything. I wasn't speaking at them, I was speaking with them. So I would just say, for me, it was just I kept using my network until I found some fertile soil and just kept making calls. It took a while for some of the buds to show up, but like I said before, once they did, I kept going back to that fertile ground. So I definitely used my network until I found the right place in an open ear.
Yeah, and one thing I would add, Katie, just because I know this because we had conversations about it, I think you leveraged learning opportunities in the right moment when there were engagements with some of our partners, and maybe they hadn't come to us early on to ask for feedback, right? And so we get something, we're like, ooh, this is not the best. And so we're going to give some feedback and maybe also have some conversations about the benefit and the efficiency of being able to engage the subject matter experts, right? The people in the community a little bit earlier in the process. And I know you worked through some of those conversations in a gentle but firm way to help them understand that, that's an important part of the partnership as well.
Yeah, and some of it was not really it was a gentle calling out, but we get more calls in. It's fun not to have to always call them for them to call us now. That's pretty exciting.
Yeah, agreed. Monique, from your perspective, what would how would you talk about building these types of connections, maybe for people who don't already have the advisory groups, or, looking at the different opportunities you've had to speak in the past? How have you helped to build connections, or what tips would you offer to our attendees?
Sure. First of all, awesome planting metaphor, Katie. And then Tamara, I thought you were going to ask me about how to find the right partner. For some reason, my mind drifted off because I'm single. Never mind. But anyway, so to your actual question to me, I just stepped up. I'm going to give you an answer from two perspectives, corporate and then also personal perspective. In my situation, I, wanted to live in my truth in terms of who I said I am from day one. I transitioned back in 2006, and, I've never lost my passion for volunteering. And so whether it was who I used to work with up until now, and that created, open doors just by networking and, people knowing my name, and it led to a lot of positions available for me. So I'm thankful for that. In terms of, corporate leadership and what's best for the company, it's always good for the company to exercise itself in ways that put policies in place that are demonstrative of everybody that are representative of the workforce within that company, and not just, the ideologies of the head of that company, which typically tends to be a cisgender white man. There's many folks within Wells Fargo, there's many folks within all other corporations, and as long as we provide room and we allow them to be empowered and let their issues or needs be known, or give them space for them to let their issues or needs be known, so that those policies and strategies can be catered to that, I think that's really what matters the most. It's really about, asking a person, what are their struggles? What are their needs? And going from there instead of making assumptions.
Yeah, that's great, Monique. Thank you for that perspective. I'm monitoring the chat here, and John, I see a couple of questions about marketing. Also a question though, and I want to stop here for just a moment on, what happens if the enterprise level work, if there were instances where the work of the gender advisory committee, became disconnected, how did we navigate? I think what I would say is we worked very hard to make sure we were listening to these committees, these groups, right, that are in place specifically to help us make sure that we're being thoughtful about how we approach the work that we're doing for inclusivity of our employees and our customers. So while there are oftentimes conversations based on, okay, this is challenging assumptions, right? Or having to figure out how bias is showing up in conversations from us not having those experiences ourselves. I think, we absolutely want to make sure that we are not only inviting them into the conversation, but actively listening. That's the whole point of making sure that we have them in the room and really are thinking about this not being a homogeneous experience across all of our employee groups, or even frankly across our gender diverse employee group, right? Our employees, they don't all have the same experiences. So making sure we're really listening to those different comments is important. John, so a couple of questions for you.
Yeah,
I think you've been monitoring them, and I'll let you tackle.
I realized that it was responding to questions that was getting me kicked out. So that seemed to be the consistent. So I stopped responding to questions. So I apologize to everyone who was putting marketing questions in there, but it was either that or get knocked out. So really early on, I know that there was a question around feedback that we got, maybe from a social media standpoint or other feedback that we got on some of the work that we did. And I'll just say, yes, we did get feedback. We got both positive feedback and we got negative feedback, as you always do when you put something out there. Gosh, that shouldn't be controversial, but sometimes can be. The negative feedback just serves to remind us that there's still a lot of work to do. But the positive feedback was always kind of grounded in this idea that it's just so good to see myself in a marketing effort, and that you're talking to someone like me and talking about someone like me. So that, to me, that cancels out all that negative feedback. And luckily we have leadership that will stand behind the campaigns when we put a campaign like this out there. And then there's
some questions about in language for marketing.
Yeah. We have done, so if you're talking about, LGBTQ marketing specifically, we did do a Spanish translation of the ad. Let's see, one of the ads that you saw, gosh, it was one of the 3 individuals, and we used that for some Spanish language media. That's the thing, is it was harder to find channels that we could leverage for the LGBTQ community that were in Spanish, that were appropriate for what we were trying to get out there. So when that opportunity exists, yes, we have done translations of our ads into Spanish, and that was exciting. I think that was the first time we had ever done that, but it was great to be able to do that. And what else?
There's one other question, John, about marketing and the support you offer to the employee group, and whether or not that covers internal comms. And although we stay very connected, we have a great communications team.
We have a comms team that does that. Yeah, and Tamara and I, and his name is Michael. We kind of form a trio that attacks this from all different directions. So yeah, we definitely have someone with internal communications that is focused on the LGBTQ market, but this is more about internal comms, in particular for events we might be planning. And Tamara, I'd turn that back to you, because you have communications chairs on the enterprise leadership team that actually focus on comms to that extent. And I think both of them are in communications with Wells, so their day job crosses over with their gay jobs.
Right. Yeah, we're really fortunate. So we have on our enterprise team a fully functional team that looks at, how do we sort of build inclusivity for our employees and with the external communities. But we have what I'm going to say are sort of subject matter experts in helping us get the business of the employee network done. So tech people, comms people who help us with planning events specifically, and then so many great resources and members and leaders who do the work of building the programming. And, I think, Ryan, this is a great segue to you when we talk about building relationships. I know you've been a chapter leader, you've been on the advisory committee, and now you're a member of the enterprise leadership team. You've obviously presented internally as well as externally. When we talk about, this idea of building relationships, what tips would you offer from the perspective of connection to those various groups or from those various roles you've held, and how that's helped to support the work.
Yeah, I think at all levels, it's really just being honest about the impact of the work that we're doing. I mentioned it in an earlier response that the visibility of sharing my story helps. I think it's helped bring folks into the fold and kind of establish those connections, and then can help deepen them. Sometimes it's a little bit more challenging than others to do that, and telling those stories and giving impact isn't quite enough. It's finding what lands for people, what makes impact for them. Whether that's if they have a child that's LG, in the community, or there's got to be an in, right? When we build any relationship, I think we have to identify exactly how we can engage with different folks in different parts of the company or external to the company. And sometimes that doesn't go swimmingly. I'll be perfectly honest and say that I'm not always good at it. I'm frankly a little too honest sometimes. But I think it's also important to building the relationships and building the connections to help support this work, to be really honest about what we actually need to do within Wells Fargo or externally, and why that matters. And at some point, if folks aren't getting on board with that, then you kind of, as Katie mentioned, find the next person in your network and tap them on the shoulder, or give them a call, because not everyone is going to buy into this, unfortunately. And it really does take a little bit of shopping these ideas around and shopping the work around to find the support. I think especially in 2020, it's been a little bit more critical for us to be very honest about what's going on in the world, and what we can do better and what we can all achieve together. And really just why any of the things that we're talking about are important and why they matter. Because I think when we hear some of the things outside in terms of outside of the company, or in politics, or where in the news about LGBTQ rights, it's a lot of the agenda, right? There's some collective meeting of queer leaders everywhere to come up with one agenda, and people kind of get sucked into that idea that we're trying to push for one or two very specific things, when really we're just trying to be recognized as humans, and given the same rights and access and as anyone else. And at some point, that's got to be the stopping point. I think for me, the honesty really helps. In a lot of cases, being authentic about my story really helps. But I think it's really important, it's been really important for me not to compromise my own integrity in where we need to go and the support that people in my communities need. Because the minute we do that, we start giving away more and more again. And we've seen how that ends. We've seen where that goes. And thankfully now, more and more leaders in our company, especially in our company, but especially, more and more leaders outside of our company are coming to that realization through all of the junk that's happened in 2020. Tamara, Monique, you can count that one on the times I almost dropped some choice language in this session. But we all know 2020 has been rough, and it's important that we don't sacrifice who we are and what we actually need to be recognized and elevated as a community.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Ryan. And we talk about incremental progress. You can achieve incremental progress while not ever losing sight of the end goal. And thinking through, okay, it's great, right? It's great we're here. Monique, to your point earlier about pronouns, great we have those, but there's so much more that's needed. And, looking at being able to then have the appearance policy follow on the heels of that, to continue the work, I think is so important. And to really keep that end goal of what really is workplace equality at the end of the day. What is that we're looking for to make sure people feel like they really belong, regardless of how they identify. Katie, I know you mentioned you might have another comment about building relationships, so I want to come back to you, and then we'll do a quick rapid fire at the end for one quick sentence from panelists, but let's go to you on that building relationship point.
Yeah. So kind of three key things that came up for me. When I reached out, I assumed positive intent, like HR is here to help support employees. Like it may not always feel like it. I'm on both sides of it, but like at an individual level, they want to do good work, right? So how do I assume that? Number two, build a really strong business case, and the stories really help. Those, the more I collected stories and helped create the humanity, to Ryan's point about this and being treated human. So a really strong business case. And three, add value, because there's nobody in HR I worked with that I did not create more work for. Like, it wasn't just to get them to nod their head and agree that I would go do these things. Other people had to change benefits. Other people had to change policies. Other people, you had to do work that they could have just gone about and done their job the same way. So how we show up as partners, adding value to to help lift their work too, and be as firm and easy to work with, like the value proposition, like we're here to help you. And I think that's part of our momentum, is we added value along the way, which is why they call us back and call us in. So intent, business case, and value, add value.
Great points. Great way to sum up a lot about the relationship building here. And so much great chat happened in our conversations today. So I want to make sure we thank all of our attendees for your participation, for asking the questions, for the back and forth in the conversation, for sharing your experiences. I'm going to quickly go around. Katie, I'm going to save you for the end because you gave us that great summation. So, but I'm going to start with Monique, and we'll go around and ask for just one short, quick thing for people to remember leaving today's conversation that should be prioritized. Monique, for you?
Think about those who are naysayers. And what we're doing is not only to change the game for us, but it's also to hopefully change the minds of the naysayers, because just because we're a corporation doesn't mean that everybody within the corporation is on board with this. And to those folks, I say that if fairness, equality, and equity is on the gay agenda, is on the women's rights agenda, is on the Black agenda, put my name at the top. Also, I want to say happy National Coming Out Day for anybody that wants to celebrate on Sunday. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Monique. Ryan, we're going to come over to you. One thing to remember.
We as a community do not deserve 2020. We are better than this. And we will persevere beyond the shit that this year has thrown at us.
All right, John, I'll come to you. Your one last thought.
I'll be quick. This journey we're all on together is not linear. It's something that evolves continually, and you need support along the way. So make sure that you have a good support team, and I'm looking at 4 of them in front of me right now. So thank you all.
Yeah, thank you to our panelists. My one reminder is not based on this session at all, but please vote. Please encourage everyone you know to vote. Tell your
Vote,
story,
yes.
Get them to vote. Voting is such a priority for the next month.
Make
Thank
sure
you all.
you're registered. You're taking people off the registration, so make sure you're still registered.
Absolutely. Thank you again all that joined us today for the conversation. Really, really appreciate your participation.